There's a very good reason why Winston Churchill's famous quip about democracy being the worst political system, except for all the others, is repeated as often as it is. But it doesn't stop 56% of Canadians from feeling that members of Parliament do not represent their constituents' views, nor does it stop 73% of Canadians from thinking that politicians in Ottawa don't deal with their issues. To help us understand where these discontented are coming from and what changes they have in mind, we welcome, from the left, Sakura Saunders, editor of protestbarrack.net and a member of the Mining Injustice Solidarity Network, and Alan Sears, a professor of sociology at Ryerson University and co-author of The Democratic Imagination, Envisioning Counterpower in the 21st Century. And from the right, this is feeling like crossfire here, right? And from the right, Marnie Supkoff, executive director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and Jan Narveson, professor emeritus, philosophy at the University of Waterloo and the author of You and the State, A Short Introduction to Political Philosophy. And it's good to have our four participants at this table tonight here at TVO. We're going to mix it up a little bit. We're going to start with you two over here. You get to watch. We'll come over to you then you get to watch, and then we'll engage as a full table after that's all said and done. So let's get started over here. The numbers that we've been quoting so far are from Samara, this public interest research group which polls Canadians from time to time and tries to get them more engaged in our democracy. And according to Samara, 45% of Canadians find our parliamentary democracy wanting. You are part of that 45%, which is why we've invited you here today. And I want to get a better understanding of why you're part of that 45%. So let's get some reasons going back and forth. Sakura, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I think it's really obvious that people would feel disenfranchised under the current political system, especially with Harper having eliminated all these, environmental laws and basically acting like a dictator within this system. But I think something fundamental as a reason why people feel disenfranchised is because we fundamentally do not have a system where people that are directly impacted by decisions get to meaningfully take part in those decisions.
Okay, that's one. You want to follow up on that, Alan?
I think another thing that's happened that's related to that is that the parameters of debate have become narrower and narrower over the last 30 years or so, that there's kind of a consensus among all the parties that, for example, austerity more or less is required, and so that the actual room for discussion around environmental issues, around social justice issues and so on is so narrow that I think often people feel excluded from that.
Why do you think it is that way?
I think that's had to do with a long-term strategy of changing our definition of politics to align it more closely with the idea of the bottom line.
Whose strategy?
I think it's a strategy we on our side often call neoliberalism, that originated with corporations and government allies to begin to try to change the character of what's thought about as politics.
But we have a fairly, we can throw these terms around, but we have a, let's call it a conservative government in Ottawa that you think takes a too austere approach. We have a fairly leftish liberal government at Queen's Park that I suspect you think takes a far too austere approach. That's sort of both ends of the political spectrum in Canada, relatively speaking, taking the same approach. We need something different?
That's exactly what I mean by the narrowing of political discussion. I would have added the NDP government in Manitoba just to get the full spectrum of what's kind of official politics in Canada. And just to say that spectrum has become narrower in many ways, and it's not just Canada. If you look at Europe and in many different places, even the idea of, for example, social assistance at a living level, which a predecessor of this government actually introduced a while ago, is now almost unspeakable politically.
Sakura, let me follow up on the point that you put forward at the beginning. This notion that we don't get to participate enough in our democracy. You're not the first person to observe this. Jeffrey Simpson from the Globe and Mail wrote a book called The Friendly Dictator, or was it Dictatorship, whatever, The Friendly Dictator, where essentially when we elect majority governments in Canada, as you've suggested, we sort of hand them the keys to the whole shop for 4 years and then check in later. What would you prefer to see that you think would be more participatory?
Well, I would prefer to see referenda style democracy where people get to vote directly on issues that impact them. I would like to see a lot less decisions being made by the federal government, period, because the federal government, has this, reign over all of Canada, and I find that entirely inappropriate. I think that...
Wait a minute, the federal government should not, it's inappropriate for the federal government to have governance over the whole country?
Yes, completely.
Meaning what?
Meaning what? I think that there's lots of decisions that should be made on a more local level.
But this national government has decentralized the country perhaps more than any other, and has certainly left provinces and municipalities to do their own thing more than any other federal government maybe in Canadian history. Not enough for you?
I wouldn't say that. I would definitely argue with that point. As well, I would also argue the point that, the Liberals represent the left and, the Conservatives represent the right. I think that both are definitely neoliberal parties, and I think it's because of the corruption of democracy due to corporate influence and the influence of money in politics. But, what I would say is that the government has deregulated, but they haven't left any authority to local governments to take its place. And I'll give you an example. So we have the Line 9 pipeline, and it's going to reverse its flow, and it's going to be approved, or it has been approved by the National Energy Board to carry Buchan.
This is Enbridge's pipeline, right?
Yes, Enbridge's pipeline. And this is a major project. They're upping the flow, they're changing the material that's going to go through it, things that are much more dangerous. And they had a National Energy Board process around it. The National Energy Board, I participated in this hearing, and they ignored pretty much every single non-industry intervener. They even ignored the requests of the Ontario Ministry of Energy. And they're not conducting an environmental impact assessment, which would have been required before Bill C-38. Now, the province is saying that they can't conduct an environmental impact assessment either because that's a federal matter, but the federal government has eliminated this requirement. And so now we're working through municipalities to demand that people step up to reject this dangerous process, because all of the non-industry interveners brought up extremely good points about why this project is so dangerous to our communities.
So you clearly want a more bottom-up rather than top-down kind of democracy, and maybe you could help us understand what you think that looks like.
Well, I think that environmental decisions, for example, would be decided based on the watershed it impacts. And so those municipalities would be the ones participating in the decision about projects that could impact the watershed. So this is just one example. And like I said, there's many models of governance that have referenda style, where people are not simply voting on a representative, but they're voting on an issue.
Like what?
Oh, like in Vermont, once a year they have these town halls where the towns get together. But even in California, for example, there's many issues that make the ballot as an issue as opposed to simply just voting for a representative.
These propositions.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Same question to you. You want to see a more bottom-up as opposed to top-down. What does that look like for you?
To me, it means that those people who are affected by a decision actually collectively and democratically act to control whatever it is. So if it's a classroom, that the people in the classroom should be actually making democratic decisions about how the class proceeds. If it's a workplace, the people who are working there should actually be making collective and democratic decisions about how the workplace proceeds.
Okay, got to stop you there. Grade 3 kids ought to decide how the...
I think that they begin to practice that. I think a lot of the democratic exclusion from children is part of the way that children actually lose rights in this society. I think what it actually means in practice is something to be worked out, but children are very active, willful learners. You just have to watch from young ages as they acquire language without any teacher saying you have to learn to speak or whatever. And
so we know they love democracy because when they're out there in the playground and who wants to do what, the hands go up and majority rules. So they learn that at a pretty young age.
And how do we carry that practice forward as opposed to shutting that down? I think we see signs of it in movements in various ways. And the only thing I would add in terms of what Sakura said is I think it's really important, referenda are important, but I think it's also really important to have the spaces for deliberation. I think real democracy also involves a lot of debate and exchange of ideas and listening to those who you disagree with. That you need to open yourself to be persuaded, even if in the end it simply allows you to reaffirm your own view. It's not that you need to be persuaded, but at least listening, discussion, debate, I think is a really important part of a vibrant democracy.
If you put on CPAC or the Queen's Park Television Network, you will see all day long wire to wire, gavel to gavel, coast to coast debates in the House of Commons or the legislature. Is that not what you had in mind?
The problem is that so few of the real issues that are there, that are around, are actually discussed in those debates. They're often discussed in a highly formalized style that feels so removed from many people, from their immediate concerns, from their immediate lives, from their existence. And the other thing is, even the way you described it, thinking about how politics becomes a spectator sport often in this society, where we are cast in the role of the ones watching it on television, as opposed to what you were saying before, the active participants in decision-making and in making our own lives together.
What role would political parties have in your kind of democracy, which requires more citizen engagement, more referenda, more participation? Where do the parties fit in?
Well, I think that, for example, a democratic movement in Quebec was the Montreal student strike, and they had spokespeople. And so there is definitely room for, people to elect a representative of sorts to carry forth the will of the people. And, something that I wanted to say, which I think is a very, very important point, is that, within the boundaries of Canada, there are many, many nations. And that's another reason why it's entirely inappropriate to have the federal government calling so many of the shots. And, maybe we can hear, your other guest speakers, your other guest thoughts on this later, because this is enshrined within the Constitution to respect treaties. And so just the fact that the federal government is responsible for so much in itself is an injustice.
Okay, but again, I want to hear more about where the political parties, where do those conservatives and liberals and New Democrats and Greens and all the others who don't necessarily have seats in Parliament, what is their role in your democracy?
Well, I think that there's definitely a role for groups to have platforms, that they're educating people on, and for, people to be elected to have these debates, but I think it should be more participatory. I think the National Energy Board hearings, in fact, even though that was a government process, that brought out a lot of people and had an incredible discussion around Line 9 due to that process. And so I think that, sure, you can have a political party that has a certain platform and has certain views on each of the various issues. But I also think that each issue should be taken separately, where there would be allowed to be a very, an open debate, that many people would be able to participate in.
Alan, do you think the political parties are open enough institutions right now?
I think the problem is much more about the range and the openness of each of them as an institution, though I think in some ways they've become less open as institutions. I think they went through a period in the 60s and 70s of a kind of opening up. And certainly one of the things that's changed a lot in a lot of the mainstream Canadian political parties is the amount of debate that's there about policy that's actually decision making. So much of the decision making now is done by the parliamentarians, and the actual conventions and so on may give them a bit of advice, may give them a bit of a temperature of the organization, but the democratic and collective control even of your own party. I think political parties are really important because they condense and clarify political differences in many ways and try to make those things coherent. I think the question is how you do that in a way that's also open to participation and discussion and learning in different ways.
But does someone not have to be? I remember when Bob Rae was premier in the 1990s, early 1990s, and the NDP platform that the party had passed was full of a lot of things that, in the face of a Great Recession, were unlikely to be implemented. And when he came to office, having to deal with the responsibility of all of these different promises that the party had committed him to, I do recall him saying, look, that's great, that's the book, but someone's got to decide in what order you do them and whether you do them and how much political currency you want to expend to get them done, etc. Someone, even in a more participatory democracy, has to be the decider, don't they?
I don't think so. I think
I
think that's where the problem comes. I think that's where the character of Parliament and the state means that rather than actually democratically unfolding as a conversation, as a debate, and so on, at some point, you're right, at this point, someone says, I am the decider. I'm the one who was elected. I'm the one who has the power. It's my responsibility to make the decisions. I actually think there's much different ways to discuss and debate if the economy is different than we anticipated. And if that means the policy has to change, let's have the forum through which we discuss how and why that happens. And that's not what happened during the Rae period. Many of the people who put the most energy into electing that government felt bitterly disappointed by decisions that seemed to be stabbing them in the back, with very little democratic accountability about how that happened.
Did you like better what came after?
No,
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another debate for another day. Thank you for getting us started here, you two. I'm going to, as strange as this sounds, move to my left and talk to the right. Jan, you're a libertarian, yes?
Yep.
How enthusiastic are you about our representative parliamentary democracy these days?
Not very.
How come?
Well, of course, now one problem is I'm a philosopher, which is, and we're airy-fairy. We talk about very large generalizations, of which I want to make one in a moment. But my problem is that practically everything government does is something it shouldn't be doing. And I very much object, by the way, to the term right as applied to us.
What would you prefer?
We say a pox on both the right and the left. So I remember once an American presidential candidate call himself a representative of the extreme center. I like that idea. But what's extreme about it is we believe in less government.
Who's we?
We libertarians.
You libertarians,
types, yes.
okay.
At the extreme, we're anarchists and think that there, in principle, should be no government at all, raising interesting, but more complicated issues. But anyway, I mean, most of the things that government decide about are things which shouldn't be decided about at all in the collective sense. They should be instead, I mean, Alan was talking about, and both of you were talking about empowerment of those affected. And I rather like that idea. But notice that I'm, for example, not affected at all by almost all the environmental issues that anybody raises. They're frankly none of my business. People living near pipelines.
How can you say that? How can you say you're not affected by government policy as it relates to in the environment?
I'm affected by government policy all the time, especially in the form of taxes. But most of the things that are done in the environment don't affect me. They affect some people.
Did you take a drink from a water tap today?
Pardon?
Did you take a drink from a water tap today?
Yes, indeed.
Well, then presumably some government policy assisted you in the fact that you didn't get poisoned by that happening.
That's true, but it didn't have to be government that did that. Well, and in fact, it probably would be better if government didn't try to do that. Never mind.
How come?
Well, you could, of course, and you can even now, you can buy water from private suppliers. It can be done. They can compete with each other and do for things like purity. Probably they come up with, well, indeed, if you want really pure water nowadays, you buy it from some firm. You don't go to the water tap, which is supervised by the government, right? In general, what government does is to make problems, public problems, that aren't actually public. And here's where we make contact with democracy. The thing about democracy is it's majority rule, as you say. And this raises a question, which is, why does a majority get to tell me what to do?
Well, there's majority rule with minority rights. There's a balance.
Right. Now, where did the rights come from? Not from majority rule. So take freedom of religion in a country that was, let's say, 75% Roman Catholic. How much freedom of religion would there be if there weren't an understanding, a constitutional restriction on it? Because if it's just the majority that decides, we'd all be under the thumb of the Catholics, or as in Muslim countries, the Muslims, or whatever. And of course, that isn't the way it should be. Religious freedom should be the rule. You practice yours over there, and I practice mine over here, and of course mine is none. But at any rate,
but we have that, don't we?
And we do, fortunately. But it's in the Constitution as a restriction. It's in the Charter of Rights. It is not something that emanates from majority rule. It isn't the majority that has decided this. By the way, I might mention, apropos of this, a fundamental point about democracy is the right of each and every citizen to vote. And that right can't be subject to majority rule. A majority can't just decide that Jim Smith doesn't get to vote, or that the X's, of whom there are 20%, that they should be can't do that. Why not? If it were democracy, just democracy was controlling it, why would we have even the right to vote? Well, that's my point. In fact, the good reputation of democracy among friends of democracy is largely due, not strictly speaking to democracy, but to something else, which is liberalism, which is a belief in fundamental rights of persons, independent of majorities. And
more to come on that in a second.
Yes.
Marnie, let's get you into this. What's the Canadian Constitution Foundation?
Oh, good. I thought you were going to ask. Anyway, I feel like I am to the center of everybody here. So, the Canadian Constitution Foundation is a nonprofit civil liberties law firm. So we actually do deal with protecting some of the rights that Jan was talking about, some of these fundamental freedoms that are protected by our charter and our Constitution, the rest of our Constitution. So what we're there to do is to make sure that they aren't getting overridden by government. So in a sense, it's another check.
Do you think our representative parliamentary democracy adequately protects those rights?
Well, not perfectly, but I think.
No, I think that would be a reasonable answer to that question.
Well, I don't think it's. I think I am much more. I am dissatisfied in many ways with it, but it seems to me, having heard everybody else on the panel speak, I think I am much more satisfied than probably the other three individuals at the table. Because I do think we do have some of these checks and balances, and one of those is the ability to take a case to court and to actually have a look at whether the government has overreached and whether these fundamental rights or freedoms are being breached, and I think that's important. And I also think I think that a lot of these discussions and a lot of the debate that we're talking about, I think can and does happen outside government, and that's fine with me. I think that's entirely appropriate. The part where I think we're running into problems is because I think a lot of the issues we have are because government has grown to such a large degree that it has too much power. If government was concentrating on fewer issues and it was a less powerful position, then much of what we would be doing wouldn't be happening in Parliament. We would be having the sort of community town hall debates that we've talked about. It would be on the local level. I also think you'd have different incentives for people to get into politics in the first place, whereas now you're actually dealing with a fairly high-paying job. You're certainly dealing with a powerful, prestigious job. I like the model where it's more of a sort of public service, kind of what city council used to be and is no longer.
Let's do the specific. You've given us the general, so let's do the specific.
Sure.
What is it? We're talking tonight from the province of Ontario. What is it that the province of Ontario, the government of Ontario, does that you think it ought to be out of the business of doing?
Well, I mean, even if you look at the government of Ontario, even if you look at healthcare, which is a huge part of our life, we are very restricted in what we as individuals are allowed to do, whether we are allowed to buy health insurance, private health insurance, which we are not. If I am a doctor, I am restricted in how I can practice. Our healthcare system is really straining. It's not going to be long before the amount of GDP that it's taking up, the amount of our budget it's taking up is just going to be unmanageable. And I really believe that that's a very good example of an area where we would probably be doing better if government was doing less.
Our population would be healthier and our illnesses would be better treated if the government were less into healthcare.
Yes, I think that's entirely possible. When you say government is less into healthcare, government is not providing healthcare.
Right.
Right now, and the system.
They're the payer. That's all.
They're the payer.
Exactly.
They're the payer, and they have provided certain restrictions on ways that hospitals, doctors, the healthcare system can offer those services to Ontarians. And so, you're not going to be talking about any different doctors. We're talking about the same service providers. These doctors are not suddenly going to get worse or less compassionate if you just had fewer restrictions or a different system, or if you were letting people actually go out and choose whatever the best option makes sense for them. You're probably also going to see a much shorter queue than we're seeing right now. You're going to see less of the problems with people who are having very poor quality of life while they're on waiting lists. It sounds like an oxymoron, but I honestly don't think it is. And when you look at other systems throughout the world, there are other systems. In fact, most systems that are still public systems have many more options for the patients.
Well, the government of Ontario is a $150 billion a year corporation, if you want to look at it that way. let's think about, I mean, it's providing health care, it provides a court system for people to, I don't have to tell you, to explore their legal grievances, it educates 1 million kids in the province every year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What else does it not need to be doing in your world?
Well, you just mentioned education, and I think that's another really good example. I think that there would be ways where the government could still be offering an education to every child, but I would be much happier if it were a system where each parent could then say, I'm going to send my kid to whatever school I want. If the government would say, we're spending X amount on each kid for each kid's education, you parent, you know your kid better than we do, you know what your kid needs, you know what your values are, you know what your kid's values are, you take it, you go find your school. I think we would suddenly see a very different system, a much more flexible system. I think we would see a much more interesting array of schools. I think you'd see happier parents. I think you'd see happier kids. You'd have less bureaucratic hoops to jump through. So it's not saying that government can't help at all. It's saying that government has to give the people who it's supposed to be helping the power to make the choices rather than being the one to make those choices for them.
Okay. Jen, is your problem the size of government or the fact that government is at all?
Well, let's see now. What's the difference between these two? If the size is 0, yes. I mean, I think basically that almost everything that government does, it shouldn't be doing. I mean, take this claim that the government educates 1 million kids. It doesn't do anything of the sort. They get educated at most by their teachers and by their peers and parents. And that there's a government back there attempting to or claiming that it somehow controls the schools is irrelevant. What the government basically does, of course, is to make us all bear the expense for it.
Well,
I mean,
it pays for it, it sets up the curriculum, it
which means,
bargains with the teacher unions and so on.
The government always is fundamentally anti-market. And when you talk about, why shouldn't the people affected have control, the answer is in the market, they do have control. If education were all private, we would pay for the education that we get. And note, by the way, even in the current system, that the cost of educating students in the public schools is higher than it is in the average private school in Canada, much higher.
Well, hang on. I think the average, I don't want to get into funding formula debates here, but I think it's about 10 grand a student, roughly speaking,
yes, roughly,
that the public system offers.
That's right.
I don't know too many private schools where you can go for $10,000. Most of them are a lot more than that.
Go look. There are a lot less across the country. At least the last I saw figures, which I think was in the Fraser Institute, they were about 40% less on the average. And then, of course, there's homeschooling, which is done very widely in the United States and fairly widely in Canada. And it's very difficult to say what the cost of homeschooling is. I mean, if the parent or one of the parents stays home to educate, then the cost might be said to be whatever his or her wage would have been.
Okay, Marnie, tackle this one. The world is an increasingly complex place. Why, in an increasingly complex world, do we want less and less government to deal with that complexity?
Because government is the least equipped to deal with complexity of anybody. Complexity, the best way to deal with complexity is to let those who are closest to the decision make the decision, because they are the ones who are factoring in all these factors that as a government, you're going to have to try and make a decision that is a good fit for all these people who each are in completely different situations. The more complex you get, the worse government is, because the government is going to have to make a one-size-fits-all solution. So I actually think it argues the other way.
Okay, let me try this follow-up with you, Jan. At the beginning of the Great Recession, which happened for a number of reasons.
You mean the recent one or the Great Depression?
No, the Great Recession, okay. 2008.
Yes.
Which happened for a number of reasons, including appallingly immoral behavior by the market and those who tend to enjoy its benefits. That's what people always say, yeah. Well, hang on. Hear out my premise before you throw me in the garbage here. Bond rating agencies, which acted with complete immorality.
Right.
And the list goes on and on and on. But basically, it was up to the public sector / government / the average taxpayer to save society from the ills of the market, because the market behaved so badly.
There you go. That's what everybody says.
And that's wrong?
Complete crap. Well,
okay.
Sorry, that's not a word I should be using.
You're allowed to say whatever you like. Go ahead. What's your view on it?
Well, I mean, the analysis has been made, and it's very, very clear that the United States government in particular began all this by really governmentally immoral and irresponsible behavior in intervening, especially in the housing market. It was...
No money down mortgages and Fannie and Freddie and all this stuff.
And that
which was a part of it,
and
no
that
question.
in turn was a reflection of an alleged study, completely, totally flawed and completely refuted study, purporting to show that people of different races were being charged different rates of interest or having a harder time getting mortgage. The people who made those studies had a tremendous amount of influence on government, even though the studies were totally wrong. In fact, there wasn't any housing, there wasn't any discrimination, except on the basis of probable ability to pay, which is a very relevant thing to discriminate against if you're a banker, for heaven's sake. Those policies were at the root of the recent American desegregation. There were other things, but those were the basic things. Then government's reaction to them. I mean, it's very interesting that in the recent years, the intervening years, government has enormously supported very large financial institutions rather than the ordinary members of the public. Why is this, I wonder? Well, of course, it's got something to do with democracy. Very, very large businesses can influence representatives in government, parliament, Congress, etc.
Indeed.
And most of their policies make sure that the people in very large financial institutions are prospering, whether or not anybody else is.
Here's where Mr. Speaker puts down the gavel and said, you've had your time, you've had your time. Now everybody, let's gather together. And
I doubt if you guys will disagree with this last thing I said.
Actually, I found a number of areas where you're on common ground, actually, which is interesting. You come at it from completely different poles, but you actually meet in the middle on some things. Right. John Duffy, who's a longtime liberal activist, a friend of the program, I think we can call him, was on this program not too long ago, had this to say. I want to play this clip and then have you guys react to it, okay? Roll tape, please.
Increasingly, we are in a world where, I think Perez was right, politics is taking a back seat to the development of science and technology and shaping our destiny. That creates probably a need for a different kind of politics so that we don't let things get out of control. But it's really a different world from the old one where politics, as they used to say, took command. The history of the 20th century could well be called 100 years of too much politics. And if you look at Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, Mao's China, you see too much politics and not enough attention to the realities, the long curves of social development and human development. Maybe it's not the worst thing to have a little less politics.
Alan, what do you think?
I actually disagree with the way that he just put it. I actually think one thing he didn't talk about during that 20th century where supposedly there was too much politics was we also achieved the relatively highest levels of social equality we've ever achieved during the period of the height of the welfare state. And with the retraction of the welfare state, the cuts in social assistance and so on, actually social inequality has increased dramatically to globally high levels in the last 20, 25 years.
Because of too little politics?
That's what I would argue is that unless we have ways, and so even though on the one hand I begin with a model of self-government, I also believe that we need to challenge the power of corporate owners and challenge the way that the market operates rather than assuming that it's going to work out for equality or for fairness through those processes.
Marnie, too much politics in the 20th century is a cause of some of our difficulties?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And it was interesting that John Duffy's conclusion was, well, we might need to change politics so things don't get out of control. I think we might need to change politics so we don't get in the way of that science and technology he's talking about. We do have some really exciting developments, and we have exciting things that are happening, but that may not happen to the full extent if politics gets in the way, or if we continue on the track that we're going, which is for government to take more and more control. I think that if we actually let this stuff flourish on its own, we're going to be in better shape.
Like what?
Well, I mean, I think like science and technology, even if you look at the internet, the move is on to, well, how are we going to regulate the internet? Things are out of control on the internet. If you look at the UK and what they are doing to try and make sure that they monitor what people are downloading, as far as if you want to download pornographic material, you have to out yourself to the cable company, basically. We're just getting more involved. And I think the beauty and the power of the internet has been that it has been this unregulated thing that has its highs, it has its lows, certainly, but it also has its real highs. It has changed the way we do business, it has changed the way we live, it has changed the way people seek democracy in countries that don't currently have it.
Too much politics in the 20th century as a cause for some of our ills? Sakura, what do you think?
Well, I think there's way too much politics at the top and not enough politics at the bottom. I mean, I think that people need to be more engaged for us to have a functional political system. And in order to do that, we need to give people access to power and resources, public resources, more commons. In Bolivia, 20% of the federal budget is distributed to municipalities to decide in council how to use those funds. And this has been accredited with many gains on the local level within Bolivia. I also think that, if you look at the federal government right now, it's completely at war with scientists. And I think that is something that's, we should really critically look at, and how much of this politicking at the top is, subjugated under corporate interests.
I have a hunch, Jen, you're going to agree 100% with John Duffy.
Well, yes, I think 0% would be about right, or close to it. Yeah, I mean, in the first place, one should point out that there are these little things like World Wars I and II, both of which were surely due to politics. What else are you going to call it? The Great Starvation in China was due to politics. It was due to politics trying to do what it shouldn't do, which is to tell people how to use their land. And
well, is that a question of politics, or is that a question of unchecked ideology?
What's the difference?
You don't see a difference?
Well, when the ideology feeds into the political system, that's the point. Politics is ripe for that kind of thing, right? I mean, politics is some people at the top have a great deal of power, and they're able to be influenced by ideologies. And if the ideology is terrible, as it is in Russia and China and all sorts of places, then you're likely to get really terrible results.
I can't tell if you're being kind of amusingly provocative by saying the best politics would be zero.
On the contrary. The only trouble, I mean, it's very difficult.
So no elections,
for most of us,
no politicians,
right.
no...
Everything would be done by voluntary organizations, acting as voluntary organizations. All of us are already members of many voluntary organizations. I mean, of course, I can't help mentioning my chamber music society, which doesn't accept government grants, doesn't get any,
This
doesn't
is the
try
one
to get any.
Kitchener?
What?
Your chamber music society in Kitchener?
In Waterloo, yeah.
In Waterloo,
It's
okay.
the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber Music Society.
Okay.
But we don't, we do indeed, we are a charitable organization that people can get tax deductions from, and that's true. And we do live on donations a lot.
But you don't get government grants?
Absolutely none.
And you have a philosophical opposition to that?
I do. And we've been operating for 40 years now, and we've done something like 75 concerts last year. Very few organizations put on more than about 8 with the assistance of a lot of government grants. You can do things if you just want to do them, and you get a bunch of people who are interested together to do them.
So what do you know that nobody else knows?
Depending on what you mean, and nobody, a fair amount, I guess.
But I mean, there are not many cultural organizations in this country that can do what they do, they say without public support through tax,
But the reason they say that is that there are politicians all ready to give them handouts if they ask for them. If they weren't available, I'm sure we would have plenty of cultural activity, probably more than we do.
Alan, can you imagine a society working with no politicians, no governments, no oppositions, merely engaged citizens?
See, I think a lot of it depends on what you mean by politics. And I thought Sakura put it really nicely about too much politics from above and not enough from below, is to me, our destinies are inextricably connected with one another. And this is where I think we may disagree, is that I believe our destinies are inextricably connected in terms of things like the environment, in terms of indigenous rights, in terms of social inequality, in terms of health outcomes, all those things. And therefore, we need to find ways to work out together a common future, because we don't actually have an individual future separate from that common future. And that means politics in the sense of deliberation, debate, exchange between people in all kinds of different ways. That I think we need much more of. And the kind of politics that we have now, I think, are often degraded in people's views. It's often bureaucratic in form, and it's often unconnected to the vibrant from below activism and so on that really can make a difference in the world.
How do we come together as a people to make decisions in our mutual, collective, individual, whatever interests, if not through parliamentary elections?
Well, I think that, the grassroots is coming together and discussing these various issues and coming up with platforms and ideas on their own outside of the parliamentary system. And I think that these voluntary organizations that Jan is talking about, they naturally form. And, what I'm talking about is empowering these sorts of configurations and, creating a structure wherein, they do have access to resources through their own pooled pooled resources, and they're able to have decision-making power for the things that impact their lives. And so, I don't think we're too far off from each other in a way where I think that, these structures that make these decisions are very voluntary. I mean, the organizations that I work with, they're all, all voluntary, all volunteer-run organizations. We're just doing it because we care a lot and we have a stake in it. Or
Marnie, who's going to protect the country in the event of war?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jen said, I probably, for me, that's why, that's one of the reasons that I think government does way too much. I think government is too big and too powerful, but I'm not ready to throw government out altogether.
So we do need a Department of Defense.
I am fine with having a Department of Defense. I'm fine with having government. I think we do need a neutral party that is in charge of the judicial system. For me, these are things that it's appropriate for government to do. And I think if government were concentrating on those things and not the millions of other things that it's doing, I think it would probably be doing a better job on those, and then we would be seeing even more of the participation in voluntary groups that we've talked about.
I have to ask you, because I'm dying to hear what the answer is. Do we have a military in Jan's Canada?
Well, in Jan's Canada, we live in a world which doesn't have any military, so there isn't any defending to do, which is very nice. Okay. And the only reason why there is a need for political defense is other countries, right? If they didn't have military establishments to threaten you, you wouldn't need to defend yourself from them.
But we don't live in that world
But we
yet.
don't live in that world. So if you're going to be one country amongst other countries that do have government, military, and so on, then you need to decide what to do. And I'm certainly, I'm not inclined to think that there is a simple solution to defense in a world in which most of the world hasn't yet seen the point. But although, having said this, I think we can do a great deal more even on that score than we do, but that's far out.
Okay. Alan, how about this one to you? We often hear that we should be citizens, not consumers. What's the distinction there in your mind?
Citizens is a complicated term because it often includes both elements of inclusion and elements of exclusion. And I think that's one of the reasons that I have some discomfort with the term citizen, is because of the way citizenship right now is associated with social exclusion and various ways of people without papers, undocumented people, and so on. But citizenship, in contradistinction from consumers, is really about the idea that we have shared collective interests, and as participants in this collectivity, we actually have certain rights, entitlements, and obligations. That's what citizenship is about. Consumers is about essentially shopping decisions, which have to do with how many resources you have. It simply enshrines the inequalities that are already there in terms of access to resources.
Can I make an interjection here? Why isn't the citizen essentially a consumer? Steve began by talking about all the services that government provides. If you provide a service to somebody, the person who's getting the service is a consumer of that service, is he not?
I don't think in the sense of consumer who buys something on the market. I know you
don't think that way. But if it's a service, then the question is, why isn't it something that you can buy on a market? After all, we all get lots of services on the market, and of course, the reason why we wealthy countries are wealthy is precisely because so many non-governmental agencies are out there providing all these things to us. It's a good model. Why isn't the citizen model preferably the model of an informed consumer who is empowered by the fact that he doesn't have to buy what the government sells him, whereas governments, of course, nowadays, we are involuntary consumers of government services.
Susan Delacourt, the Ottawa columnist for the Toronto Star, has a new book out about this very thing, about how politics turned us all into consumers who respond to ad campaigns and so on. But I don't know, seems like a good question.
I think 45 million Americans without health care might raise some questions about how ideal this consumer model is. I remember doing research on AIDS and HIV in Canada and the United States in the early 1990s with Barry Adam in Windsor and in Detroit. And it was fascinating to me to talk to people, because it didn't occur to me growing up in Canada, talking to people who actually, mothers who had to ration their healthcare decisions for their own access to healthcare because their HIV-infected children needed access to healthcare as well, and they had very limited financial resources and had to save the money so their kids could go to the doctor and they wouldn't. That's what happens when you simply make it about consumer decisions as opposed to collective and democratic
I should
ones.
get Marnie on this distinction between citizen and consumer. Do you see one?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's a matter of terminology, but I think that you can still have a consumer model where you are providing the funding. I think that's what we seem to think that, well, you either have a citizen model or a consumer model, and if it's going to be, if the government is providing the funding, then the government gets to make all the choices. And I think that's where we fall down. I think you can have a system where you say we are guaranteeing healthcare to every single person, but you're going to get to do what you want with that money. You're going to get to choose the hospital. You're going to get to choose what kind of doctor. You're going to get to choose if you want to pay more. You're going to get to choose if you want to pay less. That's the empowerment part, I think, that Jan was talking about, and that's what makes the difference. I don't think a consumer model has to mean that you go without. A consumer model more means that you're the one in charge of the decisions, and that's where I think our government has a long way to go.
Are you a citizen or a consumer of democracy, do you think, Sakura?
Well, I think that the distinction is that, a consumer is one way. If you're a citizen, in a sense, if we're going to use the consumer analogy, you'd be both a producer and a consumer. And, so for example, in Brazil, where they have participatory budgeting, this is where people do get to decide where these funds are allocated and how these funds are allocated collectively. And, there's many voluntary organizations, these all volunteer organizations, where the members pay dues. And so the dues become the collective assets of that organization, and they decide collectively how to use those dues. And one reason why it's good to have that collective moment where people do come together is that people are influenced by other ideas. And when we have this coming together where people are talking and discussing these things openly, they can be influenced by each other's ideas and also make decisions. For example, there's going to the hospital, that's sick care. But then there's also this idea of public health, or making decisions to make a good health for everybody. There's many initiatives on a public health level.
Can I jump in on this, though?
valuable.
You've given a couple of examples here, and I can just imagine people watching this saying, I think Bolivia was an example you gave, and you just gave Brazil as an example as well. And my hunch is people would say, there aren't too many people in those countries who would rather live there than here. They'd probably trade in Canadian-style democracy for whatever lifestyle they have there any day of the week. Is that a fair point?
I mean, I don't think it's a fair point. And I also think that there's many things wrong that aren't with those countries. It's very complicated, that aren't the participatory budgeting. I would think that it would be very likely that they would come here and be like, oh, why do you guys do things this way? This works way better in Brazil.
Okay.
So, that's what I would argue. And I think that, another thing that we really can't ignore is that in Canada, so much of the wealth of Canada really relies on the exploitation of people around the world through very coercive means. We were talking about private industry being extremely coercive. There's a community where there was someone just targetedly assassinated next to a Canadian mine this last Sunday. A man and his daughter, both anti-mining activists, were shot when the daughter was killed. This is a community where there's been 14 referendum, where tens of thousands have participated to reject the Tahoe Resources mine, a Canadian mining company. And this is the second targeted assassination of an anti-mining activist in that region. And so, what I'm saying is that there's many other factors at play here when we're talking about the reasons why people in Canada are so complacent with our current political situation.
Well, there is a, Jan, let me try this with you. My hunch is there are a lot of people in our representative parliamentary democracy who actually don't want the responsibility that we're all talking about here today. They actually don't mind the idea of electing somebody to worry about making sure the potholes are filled, the army is well armed, the healthcare system is well stocked, et cetera, et cetera. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Yes.
And therefore?
Well, in the first place, I think that political apathy is very justified. It's a standard theorem in politics that that it is not obviously rational to cast a ballot in any democratic election.
It just encourages them.
Why? Because the probability that your vote will make the difference you want it to make is very, very low. It's not zero, but it's very, very close to zero. And when that's the case, you do better by watching TV than by going down to the polls.
You know what, though? We were just in North Bay not too long ago,
Yes.
where the local member of parliament won by 18 votes last time. So when you say your vote doesn't really mean anything.
It isn't that it can't, it's that it rarely does.
Well, okay, I guess that's...
Right? Now, but I mean, because my objection to democracy as a way of doing things is much more fundamental than that, because I just don't think that a democratic election is what should be determining almost anything, and maybe anything, but certainly almost anything in our lives. What should be determining it rather is the voluntary interaction of individual people, period. That's
Okay.
what should be determining it.
Alan, I got a quote for you here. Oscar Wilde, who said more than 100 years ago that the problem with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings, which is not a bad quote, actually. Sure, in the best of all possible worlds, wouldn't it be great if everybody were far more engaged and informed and wanted to spend 24/7, fretting about the big issues of the day? But we don't live in that kind of world. And that's okay, isn't it?
I think there's two things. First of all, I think one of the things is, how is it that we learn apathy? Rather than thinking that people are naturally apathetic, how do people actually get removed? Because I think people are very concerned. I understand the quote and the idea of too many meetings. I think people are very concerned, just for example, about climate change and environmental problems right now. My sense, talking to people, there's a lot of concern out there. If people aren't acting about it, it's not because they don't feel concerned, it's because they feel powerless. And I think the question about how people learn powerlessness in this society is really the crucial thing. Once you begin to have a sense of power and a feeling of power, I think that sense of the meetings changes. The meetings, if it's all external to you, if it doesn't seem to have a worthwhile outcome, if it seems to be those things that the hardcore meeting goers do, it's easy to see how people think, and people are exhausted by overwork and so on. So I really think a truly deliberative system would require thinking about work differently, thinking about a lot of things, because if you're totally time starved, if you're taking care of the kids and running out to work and so on, the idea of another meeting on top of that is certainly a problem. So it does require a rethinking right from the beginning, but I think that meetings become exhilarating as, for example, the General Assemblies of Quebec students that decided on the strikes 2 years ago can become really exciting. Even people find a patience for them if the outcomes actually matter to them.
Except those two student leaders who got elected a year and a half ago both lost the other night.
Yes, and they were the student leaders from the more conservative wings of the student movement that didn't have that same amount of collective and democratic tradition.
Okay, we got about 2 minutes left here, and let's do one last, I think hopefully kind of fun thing. Have they said anything tonight that you agree with?
Yes. Yes, no, I think the idea of trying to bring the vote down to make sure that people who are actually getting people closer to voting on what is actually happening rather than being very far away from and just voting for someone and then forgetting. I believe in that. I think that probably the most important part of democracy is the most local part because of that, and the idea of empowering people to make their own decisions.
Sakura, anything they've said on the other side of the table you can sign on to?
Yeah, I think that the corruption of politics by big business is definitely something that I can agree on. We just said one of the major points of agreement, which is that decisions should be made closer to the area of impact, and that's something that's greatly lacking in our current democracy.
Jan?
I want to reverse that. It's the corruption of businesses by government that bothers me. It's the fact that government is there for businesses to become corrupted by. They shouldn't be able to do that. They should be on their own, either making it or not in the market, which is the right place to do.
They've co-opted
all
each
of
other
these
in some
things.
respects.
Indeed, yes. Adam Smith already commented on it. That you don't see businessmen getting together, but what the first subject is, what can I get the king to do for me today? And how can I get him to exclude all my competition? Well, that's exactly what should be going on. And if there were no government, of course, it couldn't be going on.
Alan, last 30 seconds to you. Do you hear anything over here you like?
I think that we all probably around the table share certain ideas in common about self-government and the importance of people running their own lives. And we have very different ideas about what that actually means. But I do think that that's what we share. And so I heard stuff about self-government that I think we do agree on.
Well, I have to say, you're all right. This was a lot of fun. Alan Sears, the professor of sociology at Ryerson University. Sakura Saunders, the editor of protestbarrack.net. If you want to go to her website, you can check that out. On the other side of the table, Jan Narveson, the professor of philosophy emeritus, University of Waterloo. Marnie Supkoff from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Good of all four of you to come in tonight and indulge in our democracy series, such as it is here on TVO.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.